Well, thank you everyone and welcome to today's Thanksgiving embroidery. So we are going to be working on some tablescapes for Thanksgiving, and I hope that you play along with me. I'm going to provide a pattern here. There's a PDF that we're going to drop into the chat. So please feel free to join us with that, or you can make up your own pattern. Or if you have another project and you just want to stitch along with us today and just kind of hang out and have a little bit of a stitching circle, that would be just fine too. So what we're going to be working on are some lettering, some simple designs that we can put onto napkins, onto table runners, onto things like that, just to really spice up your Thanksgiving table. Or if you're being invited to someone else's Thanksgiving table, it might be a cool thing to bring with you as part of your gift. I also want to talk to you a little bit about using some of the techniques and things that we're talking about to make a garland. So you can get some of these felt leaves. They're actually usually in the kids section, Creatology, but they're beautiful. They're already cut out. They're a really nice piece of felt. And so then you can go and stitch and use some of the embroidery stitches we're talking about today on the felt and then kind of connect them into a larger garland. So if you're really interested in this garland, there is a garland class that I taught using all these different materials and teaching you how to make the pom-poms and things like that. So we'll put that into the chat if you want to try and find that on our Michael's YouTube channel. But today we are going to work on the running stitch and we're going to work on the back stitch. And with only those two stitches, we're going to make some really beautiful table linens. So whether you're doing a tablecloth, a table runner, or some cloth napkins or things like that, that's kind of what we're going to work on today. So let's switch over to my other camera and I'll show you what we're doing and how to do it. So you're definitely going to want an embroidery hoop. If you have either a wooden embroidery hoop or if you have a plastic one, either are fine. Anything from 6 to 8 inches, depending on the size of what you're working on. I found this beautiful napkin in the section at Michael's where it's like where the wedding stuff is. So there's some table runners and some ways to make your tables more glamorous and fancy in that aisle. So if you have a table runner, you can cut it into smaller napkins. You can use some tea towels. You can also take any cloth napkins you might already have and just add a little touch of this embroidery. So all of that's kind of up to you. But these are the patterns that I'm working with today. These are Michael's designs that just say grateful and blessed. And I put it in several different sizes so that depending on what you're going to put it onto, if you want it larger for something on a table runner, so maybe at the end of your runners, you have the saying, or maybe in the center, you have the saying, and then there's space for everybody's place settings. Or if you want to do something like a napkin, then I gave you a couple of smaller size options too. So I'll show you how to transfer these onto your hoop. I'll show you that running stitch and the back stitch, and then we'll just spend some time stitching together. So thank you so much for joining me live today. I really always appreciate having you here with me, chatting with me in the chat. So thanks for coming. We're going to start with, I printed this out. I just put some dots down, and this is how I'm going to teach you this basic running stitch and back stitch, just because it's going to be easier for me to talk about with those different letters. I'm going to take one of my embroidery needles, and I tend to keep my needles kind of in one place on some kind of piece of felt or something like that, so I can always grab different size needles. And then I'm going to use some embroidery floss. So the embroidery floss that I put today, yeah, there's some thread that has a little bit of glimmer. It would be so nice to add just that little bit of shine into the words. I think that's a great idea too. So this particular pack of loops and thread embroidery floss is called like forest colors or something like that. And I absolutely love all the different colors that come in this pack. I just think they look really nice together. Lots of different options, especially for a Thanksgiving table and some Thanksgiving embroidery or any kind of woodland creatures kind of theme. I just really like this assortment. So I'm going to pick something that's going to show up on this blue. So I think I'm going to pick this orange to get us started. And one thing you need to know, if you don't already know, is that embroidery floss usually comes with 6 strings inside of the whole entire thread. So what that means is that inside of this, there are 6 tinier little strands that make up this embroidery floss. So you can see that I kind of pulled apart a couple of them. And you want to decide how many of these different strands you want to use for different embroidery projects. I tend to use 3 strands. And what's nice about using 3 strands is that I have 3 strands here and I have 3 strands here. So when I run out of this thread that I'm using, I can go over and use this section also. 2 strands, if you have a smaller needle and 3 strands aren't going to fit through, you can use 2 strands, especially if you're doing something teeny tiny. I think 3 strands is nice. You could use all 6, but it is going to get a little bit thicker. And you might not be able to fit all 6 through your needle, depending on what size needle you have. So keep that in mind. And when I'm pulling this, I'm gently pulling this apart. And usually I do this with my teeth too, because I'm a crazy weirdo, but I'm not going to do that on camera today. I'm just going to gently pull, and it's twisting and untwisting and letting itself unravel. So don't go too fast or else you will get a knot for sure. And notice that I didn't cut a very long piece of embroidery floss to begin with. You don't want anything much longer than about 18 inches or so, because it is just going to start tangling and getting into knots. So you don't want too much. You just want enough to get yourself started. I'm tying a knot into the end of this just to kind of keep my place on the back of whatever material you're sewing into or embroidering into. I tied a couple of knots right there at the end to give me kind of a stopping point. And then of course the old threading the needle trick. So hope your eyes are ready to do some of this work today. There we go. And I was able to thread that through pretty easily. Now here is the running stitch. So the running stitch is something that looks like a dashed line. So what happens with the running stitch is I take the point of my needle and I come from the bottom of my fabric, and I'm going to come up here at point A. And I'm going to pull all the way through until the knot I made hits the back of my felt. Then I'm going to go down to point B, and I'm going to push down through the felt this way and pull it nice so that it lays nicely there. And then I'm going to come up at point C. So the reason why I'm coming up at point C is to give me that dashed line. So here we go, up at point C, down at point D, up at point E. And you'll notice because I put these dots, I used a ruler when I drew these dots onto the felt. But you'll notice that my stitches are nice and even. There's the same amount of space in between the stitches as there are for the stitches themselves. And I did that on purpose. It's a little harder when you don't have a grid or when you don't have lines on your design to be able to keep your stitches nice and even. But with a little bit of practice, you really start getting the hang of how big to make those stitches and how big to make those spaces in between. So this is called the running stitch. Very basic stitch, useful for lots and lots of things. So keep that in mind if you ever want to do a little bit of hand sewing also. I'm going to tie a knot on the back. And I'm going to tie one more. And then I'm going to show you the back stitch. So I'm curious, those of you who are with me today, if you've done some embroidery before, if you're a little bit more advanced than this, or if this is good for you, if this is a good beginner lesson and you might need that. So let me know if you've ever tried embroidery, if you've ever done any kind of needlework before. Never before. Okay, well, good. We're in the right place then. So even if you love embroidery, which I do too, it's always nice to kind of go back to the basics every once in a while and just kind of know what's going on. So here comes the back stitch. So with the back stitch, I'm going to start exactly the same way I did with the running stitch. But instead of leaving this gap, I'm going to go backwards, and that's why it's called the back stitch, to fill that in. So it will be a solid line instead of a dash line. So good. Oh, I tried almost 200 years ago. That's hilarious. The chat is funny. So it looks like we have some people who just love to embroider. So I'm so glad that you're with us, and just go ahead and start whatever project you're working on and just kind of enjoy the time together with people who also love this craft. So I'm coming up at point A, and I'm going to pull it all the way until the knot stops me. I'm going to go down at point B, but this time the way that this stitch is different, the back stitch is different from the other stitch I showed you, the running stitch, is that when I come up at point C, instead of going forward to go to point D, I'm going to go backwards to point B, and I'm going to fill in that gap. So then that makes more of a continuous stitch, which is going to be a much nicer stitch, especially for the lettering that we're going to do today. Now you have options. You can come up at point C and go to point D, or I'm going to go to point D and then come back to point C. Then I'm going to come up at point E, and I'm going to go back to point D. I'm going to come up at point F, and I'm going to go back to point E. And you can do that as many times as you want, and I can practice and make those as straight and as even as I want to. And then I can tie this off on the back. And those are the only 2 stitches that we need today. So if you've never done any of those stitches before, now you have those in your arsenal, and you can do lots of other fun things. It looks like since some of you love embroidery and are kind of already into this, let me show you another thing that I was working on. So this is just a cute little winter sweater or a fall sweater. So I love this. I found an outline of a sweater on Canva, and I went ahead and just kind of traced the outline, and then I made up the design as I went. So if you're looking for a new project, maybe you want a little sweater weather in your life instead of a hot, sticky Miami heat in Florida or wherever you might be. So this is another option that, besides the napkins, if you want something for yourself, that you can kind of make too. So keep that in mind. You have lots of options, and we'll spend some time together making something cool. Now, if you are going to make a napkin, I did make some mistakes on the first couple of napkins that I tried to make using this pattern, because I didn't really think through how I was going to place the napkins on the table. So I started by putting my little saying here in the corner, but then what I found was, how am I going to fold this napkin in order to get that saying? Like, maybe I should have put it on the diagonal here if I was going to gather the napkin like this. So first, before you decide where to put your design, think about how you're going to fold your napkin, or where you're going to put your table runner. Do you want the design to be at the end of the table? Do you want the design to be in the center of the table? Where do you want it? So this time when I'm working on this smaller napkin, I've decided that the way I'm going to fold it to put it onto a table is going to be kind of like a classic rectangle. And then I might have a little bit of a gather up top here. If I have a little napkin ring, it'll be here. And so I'm planning to have my design right here. But do think for yourself where you're going to put your design based on how you're going to fold your napkin. So do yourself that favor, because I didn't think about that the first time I tried to do this. And then I do have this PDF that has the different size, Grateful and Blessed and Gathered Together. Of course, you can make your own. You don't have to use the ones that I'm using, but I'm going to go ahead and use this Gathered Together. And I'm going to show you how to transfer this design. There's a couple different ways to do this. And some of you probably already know about different transfer paper you can print onto, and you can wash off different labels and things like that. I tend to stay away from some of those because I find that they usually have some kind of adhesive that starts sticking to my needle and making it harder for me to work through. So what I tend to do is a little bit more old school with just tracing. So I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to get myself my hoop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to place, this is where I want it. And a little bit of a smaller hoop, I think. There we go. I'm going to place this towards that bottom section, but center it. And I'm going to place it underneath my fabric in my hoop. So this is the section where I want it in this middle rectangle. And I'm going to put my hoop in here. And you do want it nice and tight. I could unscrew it and make it a little easier on myself. This is not supposed to be the hard part, by the way. This is just me being silly today. I'm really having a hard time. There we go. I don't know what my deal is. I'm sorry. Oh my goodness. The material is thick. Thank you. Someone in the chat is giving me a little bit of grace, and I'm going to give myself that same grace. So thank you. I appreciate that. All right. I still have it in the right place. Super. I'm tightening it. It is not 8 o'clock. You are right. All right. Finally. So this is the correct rectangle that I want it to be in, and I do tend to want it to be towards this bottom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of masking tape and I'm going to tape it underneath. And you can tell that my fabric is light enough that you can see your pattern. So that's the easiest call, is if you have a dark enough pattern and a light enough piece of cloth, you can easily see it. You can also put a light, maybe even the flashlight from your camera underneath it in order to help you trace. If that's not working, there are other ways to do transfers using different graphite papers. I tend to think the graphite paper, when it comes to embroidery, is just going to get a little bit too messy, and it's not going to give you the look that you want, I don't think. So I'm just going to put a little bit of masking tape, make sure that this is still where I want it to be. And I do think, so a question, is it a special fabric? And this particular fabric is like a linen, so it is a little thicker. It's not just straight up cotton. It's not super, super thin, but the Aida cloth that someone else was mentioning in the chat looks like this. So Aida cloth is probably what you're used to seeing for stuff like cross stitch, because it already kind of has a grid built into it. So you can keep that in mind. You can use any kind of cloth that you would use for a cloth napkin already, or this table runner can kind of be cut apart. And if you have just a little bit of sewing skills, you can just make yourself a seam and cut the table runner into several different napkins if you want napkins instead of table runners. So now that I have that attached here, I'm going to take a black fine tip Sharpie, but if you have a washable marker, fabric marker or something like that, go ahead and use it. I'm using a Sharpie so that you and I can see this together. But if it's thin enough, honestly, as long as you're able to cover up with your stitches, you won't be able to see this. So the color doesn't really matter. The kind of marker or pen doesn't really matter, as long as you're going to be okay with your stitches. If you're feeling brand new at this and are a little bit worried about your stitches, then go ahead and use something that's washable, so that after you mark it, you can wash it back off. And I'm not caring about the thickness of the letters. I'm just caring about the placement of the letters and the style of letters. I love when someone else has already written something in a beautiful font or handwriting, because then I don't have to do it myself. So I've written that gather, and then I'm paying attention to the together. And there are some extra little lines on the end of the letter T. This font has some of those extra little letters, and I like those extra little parts to the font. And so I want to make sure that I include them when I'm tracing. So like the G has a little bit of a straight line right here, and that's going to be pretty easy and pretty fun to stitch also, to make it look pretty nice. So the E has the little hooks, and the E has the little parts on the end of the E. The T has the little flags at the end. And I'm just taking my time, making sure that I get all the letters in a nice placement and a nice font. And then we're going to use those stitches we were talking about and go ahead and make this. So the E has a little line at the end coming off the back of the E, and it has the little tails at the bottom and top. And then here's my R, a little bit of a tail. And I can always double check and make sure that I kind of I know on my R, I forgot the little bar on the first part of the R right here. So I'm going to go back and add that in. But this looks really nice, and this is ready for us to start stitching. So next you want to pick your colors. I tend to like two colors, one really dark and bold color for the top word, and then maybe something a little bit lighter for the bottom. So this gather in like a red and maybe a gold for the together, something like that. Or I used a brown for my grateful, and then another like light brown or kind of like a tan or a beige with my blessed. So however you want to do that, I think I'm going to work with a dark green. So I really like this dark forest green. I'm going to pull a little bit of this floss, embroidery floss, and I'm going to cut it off. And then remember before when I was showing you that original stitch, you're going to break this 6 strands down into 2 sections of 3 and 3. So I'm going to break that apart, and I'm going to find 3 strands over here and 3 strands over here. And I'm gently and slowly and very patiently, I'm telling myself these things, going to pull these apart so that I have 3 strands to work with on my embroidery needle. All right, there I go. And on one of the ends, I'm going to tie a nice knot, probably 2 or 3 knots to make sure that it doesn't come through my fabric. There we go. Oops, missed. There we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and thread this through my embroidery needle. There are needle threaders, so if you're really struggling with threading your needle, there's some little pieces of wire that can go through the eye of the needle and grab things a lot easier. So don't struggle forever. Just go ahead and use that extra tool if you can find one. There we go. All right. Now I'm going to be using a back stitch for the gather. So I'm going to start down here, and I'm starting right here at the point of this cursive letter G. I'm going to pull my embroidery floss all the way through until the knot catches on the back. And then I'm going to go ahead and make a stitch down. And that's how I've begun both my running stitch and my back stitch. But now because I am doing the back stitch, I'm going to come up further. So I'm going to come up a little farther from where I was before and go backwards to where my green floss is. And then I'm going to come up a little bit in front of the stitch I just made and go back. So you can do a pretty decent size stitch, which is going to save you some time. But then when you start to get to some of those special curved parts, you're going to need to maybe make your stitches a little bit smaller to match the curve a little bit better. So here you'll notice that my next stitch is going to be a little bit smaller in order to really match that curve. So do you see how I made it a little bit off and I didn't quite make that? I can go back, I unthreaded it, and I'm going to take this off. And I'm going to undo my last stitch. So the way that you can undo stitches is just by using your embroidery needle to kind of pull out the last stitch by kind of going under it with the needle and then being able to undo it. So in order for me to match that line better, I'm going to need a shorter stitch. So I'm going to go a little bit closer than I was before. There we go. So there's a good question in the chat that's asking about there's a thread that cannot be separated. And that is true. I might even have some of that somewhere. Here is one. So this one is a thread that you can tell it has a little bit of a different texture to it, but it is not made up of 6 strands. It might, I don't know if it's made out of any strands at all. It might just be one, because when you try to pull it apart, you actually can't pull it apart. There are no strands. So you can still use this. The only thing you need to make sure is that the thickness of it actually fits through whatever needle you're working with. And then yes, just use it as is. There's no need to pull it apart because it literally can't be pulled apart. But that's going to work. So you can use that, just make sure you have a big enough needle. All right, I hit that curve a little bit better with a smaller stitch this time. And so I'm just kind of changing different sizes in order to meet those curves and make sure that I'm doing justice to the font and making those letters stand out really nicely. So this is a good time that I'm just going to be stitching for a little bit. If you have questions, this is a great time for me to kind of go through anything that you might want me to go over with you. Otherwise, we can just kind of enjoy the stitching time together. I can also talk to you about some of the other ways you can use the same type of embroidery we're doing today in some of your Thanksgiving decor. So instead of making cloth napkins, you can always just make a fabric napkin ring. So maybe you don't have the time or don't want to take the time to make every single person an embroidered napkin. Understandable. You might have a very large Thanksgiving party. But what you could do is maybe take little pieces of fabric and maybe just put each person's letter. So maybe they're like place cards and they can go onto the napkins or go next to the seat. And maybe it's just one letter for each person's name. And you can wrap it around a blank napkin. Even if it's a paper napkin, you can still make it a little bit fancier by adding a little pop of a fabric ring. Another tradition that I have never done, but I saw it a couple years ago and I thought it was absolutely genius, was, a lot of times your Thanksgiving table changes. So you might have new people in your family, you might have lost some people, different things happen, you invite different groups of people into your life and into your Thanksgiving table. And so one of the things that I saw that I loved was they had a blank tablecloth, kind of like the cloth that we're working with right now. And they had people take Sharpies and sign their name. And then they would put like Thanksgiving 2024. And then they would have the list of all the names of people who were at the table together. And then somebody would take it after the Thanksgiving meal and go back and do just what I'm doing right now and use some embroidery stitches and kind of take those names and make them more permanent onto the tablecloth. And then the next year you pull out that same tablecloth and then you have everybody sign again, Thanksgiving 2025. And you kind of keep it like a collection of autographs, a collection of memories. It's something that you can pass down to different people in your family, and just a really nice way to remember the people that were important to you at different points in your life. So I thought that was genius. And I love that idea of just taking people's signatures and embroidering them and keeping that tablecloth year to year. All right. So I don't know if the cloth napkins are still available at Michael's, but I do know that the table runner is available. So what I can recommend to you is you can buy the table runner. And if you would prefer napkins over the table runner, it's just going to take a little stitch on a machine in order to make them into individual napkins. So if you're okay with sewing, you will be able to easily turn that table runner into several smaller cloth napkins. Also, a lot of times in this section at Michael's where it sells all the different like Cricut and sublimation things. There's a lot of times there's fabric over there too that is good for napkins. We also sell fat quarters, which are just like cotton fabric. So all of those are good things to be able to work on and do this kind of embroidery and then be able to use them as cloth napkins at your Thanksgiving table. So I just finished by pulling my knot at the end. And the reason why I finished was because I was running out of thread. So luckily, when I pulled apart my 6 strands, I had 3 strands and 3 strands. So I'm ready to go. And I can just add these 3 strands to my needle and keep going with the next letter on my work. If you happen to be making anything with your embroidery today, I'd love to see it. So you can share it on Instagram. We have a channel called Learn with Michaels where we talk about all the different classes that we're teaching and all the different projects we're working on. So feel free to tag us or use that hashtag Learn with Michaels so that we can see what you are working on. I'm going to go and start my letter A and just keep using this back stitch and filling it in as I go. And when I wasn't talking and doing this in front of people, I think I was able to do the whole gather word in about 15 to 20 minutes. So I think you could finish this whole entire thing, taking your time and kind of doing it by yourself in a half hour. And again, if that sounds daunting or sounds like too much, you don't have to make a cloth napkin for everyone. You can just put this pattern into one spot on a tablecloth or a table runner. Or like I said before, maybe you just want to do an initial for each person. Maybe you don't want to do a whole phrase. So there are ways to adapt the project for the time that you do have and the effort that you are willing to put into this. But yeah, I love some of these crafts that kind of go back to our roots, right? And just, I love having this kind of stitching time with those of you who are online with me right now. And if we were sitting in someone's living room, we could start gossiping and talking and chatting and letting each other know what's going on. Love it. So in a moment, I'm going to switch and I'm going to go down to the word together because I do want to point out a couple of those things. But again, if you have any questions, let me know in the chat. I will tell you too that you can add beads to your work. So if you wanted to make this all beaded, you're going to need a thinner embroidery needle and you're going to need to make sure that your needle and your thread go through each one of these beads that you might be using. So I haven't made a pattern yet. I was just kind of testing it out, but you could do the letter using beads rather than using stitches. It's going to take a lot longer and also might be a little bit more difficult to wash, but if you need to or want to add some extra bling to anything, you absolutely can. Or there are definitely some loops and thread embroidery floss that have those flecks of like gold in them that would really make this shine even more so. And once I finish this T, I'm going to switch over and I'm going to go down to the together word because there's some kind of fun ways that we can make that font really pop nicely with our stitches. It's going to work really nicely with our stitches. And when you can get a longer stitch in, go ahead and do that and save yourself a little bit of time. You won't really be able to tell on this particular piece if your stitches are uneven because there are so many curves. No one's going to say, oh, that stitch is so much longer than the other one. You could use the beads if you're doing a napkin ring. Absolutely. That is actually the perfect use for beads. See, this is why y'all are here. We can all work together on this. All right, so I have that. I'm going to switch over to one that I had already started. So I already have the word gather done. And I'm going to go ahead and have this together. So yes, there is a template. There is a PDF that is in the chat. So if you're not able to open that, let us know. If anyone has been able to successfully open that, let us know so that we can help other people who are trying to grab it. I'm going to use some yellow for my together. And because this is so small, I'm going to go down to only 2 strands instead of 3. Okay, so it sounds like we're having issues with it. But one thing we can do is we can go back after the class and I can email everybody who's here today and I can attach that PDF to an email. Oh, good. Some of you were able to open it. So we will find a way to get you that PDF. And if nothing else, when this video appears on YouTube on Monday, it should have that PDF link to it as well. Of course, no problem. So I'm using 2 strands instead of 3 strands for the smaller letters of together at the bottom. If you don't have a template, another good option is always stencils. So Michael's has a really extensive collection of different stencils. And the stencils won't necessarily say phrases like this, but if you want, like, especially letters, if you're going to embroider some letters, there's some really nice stencils and lots of different fonts. And it is very easy to use a stencil to get yourself going for embroidery rather than having to find a printer and print something out and then using the masking tape like we did to get that design underneath it. So yes, there is a knot at the back and I will absolutely show you that. When we're starting, I'm just collecting a bunch of knots at the end. And the reason why I'm doing that is so that it doesn't pull through my fabric. So I am going to start here at the top left-hand corner of the together. And the knot stopped it on the back. So I pulled it all the way to make it stop at the back. And I'm going to go all the way across with that 1 stitch all the way across the letter T. And then with the little tail on the T, I'm just going to pop down a little tiny bit. And I'm going to over exaggerate it a little bit on the top just to be able to get that kind of flag at the end of the T. And I'm going to go to the other side and I'm going to do the same thing. And pull that down just a little bit to have that letter T. And if your color is too light or you feel like you can't see it, then you can always go over it more than once, because remember, we are only using 2 strands this time. But I think you're going to be able to see it just fine. And then right here, I'm going to do a little tail across the bottom. There we go. I like that already. Now, if you want to be super, super tedious, you can tie a knot right here before you start. But because these letters are pretty close to each other, I'm okay with dragging the thread along the back. In the O, you're not going to want to make very big stitches. So what I was just talking about is there's gonna be a little thread underneath here that goes across to go from the letter T to the letter O. And if you're using a dark colored thread, you might actually be able to see that if your fabric is super light. So you might want to tie off each one of the letters if you're using a darker floss so that you can't see the in-between through the fabric. So keep that in mind. But because I'm using a lighter color with these letters, it's going to make it a little bit easier on me and I don't feel the need to tie it off in between. So take smaller stitches when you're doing your O because you want to be able to hit all those curves as best you can. Looks like I'm making mine almost into a hexagon with probably about 6 stitches to get as round as I can. I love this already. It's really nice. Or maybe there's like a tea towel that you can do this little saying on and give it to someone as like a gift when you come, if you're visiting someone's home during the holidays. So I finished my O, and I think my stitches were short enough that it looks pretty nice and it looks pretty round. And then I'm going to go over to my letter G. And again, I'm not tying off in between, but I could, because if this stitch is long and a dark, it could potentially show up in between. So keep that in mind. And there we go. So I'm going to keep working on this, and I'm going to share my finished project on my personal Instagram, which is the number 4M Coleman. And if you want to see some of the other things that I've been working on, and coming up next week, I'm going to be teaching a class on how to make a crochet cowl. So a cowl is like a circular scarf instead of it having tails. So I'm going to be teaching how to make this neck scarf that just kind of is like a neck warmer sort of thing. So if you've ever wanted to try and crochet, you can join me next week and do that. I'm also teaching a class next week where we are making a punch needle tufted nutcracker. So punch needle, if you love embroidery, you may love punch needle as well. So consider that, because it's a really fun way to do embroidery with yarn rather than with embroidery floss. It's a lot faster than embroidery. So if you don't feel like you have the patience for embroidery, you can switch over to punch needle, and that might be your jam. So I like giving you lots of different options of new hobbies and fun things to kind of dabble in. And I teach classes on Thursdays and Fridays online. So I am always looking forward to seeing you. So when I do the little tails, do you go over the end of the previous stitch? I do. Yep, I go right over it. So like with this letter E right here, I'm going to go to the top of the E. So I'm going over top of that stitch rather than going in front of that stitch. And then when I'm about to do my letter E going across, I'm starting a little further out because it has a tail, but I'm definitely going to go over top of that stitch I just did before. Great question. It is okay if they overlap. That is just fine. Here we go. Looking pretty good. And I'm going to start with the tail of the T going across. And I'm going to go, I don't know if you call that underneath it, but I'm going to go down from where the stitch is so that when I go over top of it, I go over the tail. And I think after I finish this letter T, I'm going to wrap things up. I hope that's not anticlimactic for you since I'm so close to the end, but I've really enjoyed my time embroidering with you today. I hope that you learned some new skills, or at least enjoyed our time stitching together. And please join me again for any of the classes on Thursdays and Fridays. And if you want to craft in between Thursdays and Fridays, you can always come to our Michael's YouTube channel and see some of the classes that we've already done. So thank you everybody for joining me today. I hope that you had a good time. I can't wait to see what kind of things that you embroider. So if you're making napkins, if you're making little sweaters, if you're making table runners or napkin rings, share it with us at Learn with Michael so that we can see what you're making. And I hope to see you again really soon. Bye everyone.